Jamie, could you just start off by giving us a picture of how the music industry has fared these past 18 months or so?
So it's been an incredibly difficult 18 months for the music industry. We're in an industry that thrives on social contact. We exist on and succeed on close-knit events, events happening, taking place. And since March last year, many of these have essentially been banned by law. Large events have been made illegal. You can be having some events over the past couple of weeks, but they've had to be socially distanced. They've had to have capacity limits. And for many venues, particularly small music venues, that's just not economically viable for them to be taking place. So it's been incredibly difficult for an industry that generates close to £6 billion a year for the economy, that supports 200,000 jobs across the whole country. And so the 21st of June for many of us has been the date we've been looking back to, getting our lives back together, starting up again and being able to pick up the pieces from what's been an awful 18 months for the whole country.
How big a problem would it be for the industry were that 21st of June date be delayed by weeks, maybe months?
So I think as an industry, we're not being irresponsible. We're not being cavalier. We're not saying there's not a pandemic happening. For us, it's in our interest to beat this virus. Now, we don't want to open in June only to be closed in July because of another wave of the virus. So we're not saying it'll be awful if we don't open. Let's just open up. We're saying, how can we be operating on 21st of June? How can we be restarting, but doing it in a safe way? So our whole industry has had a laser-like focus on how we can be operating safely in the context of a pandemic. So looking at things like testing, engaging in trials on testing, ventilation, certification. We've had a number of pilots and programs in the past few weeks where we've demonstrated that we can be doing these things safely. Of the events research program pilots that took place over the last month, of the 58,000 attendees who went to these events, only 15 positive cases have been linked to them. So we've demonstrated that we can be doing events safely and we can be doing events viably from the 21st of June onwards.
Do you think that vaccine certification or passports or whatever you want to call them, is that a price worth paying if that's what it takes to get these venues back open again?
Absolutely. So I don't think certification is something that every venue is saying we absolutely want it to be happening permanently. But I think when you think about it, there were 5,000 new cases yesterday. And what you don't want is for events to be happening with any of those 5,000 people in an event space. The risk is created by infectious people in an event space, potentially passing it on to others. Now, having a system where you can say, rather than stopping activity and opportunities for 66 million people, you actually have those restrictions for those who are infectious and make sure that you do not let infectious people into your spaces. That's good for the public health effort because we're stopping potential transmission. And it's good for our industry because it means we can get up and running again. So some form of certification, if that's what's needed, our industry would be is very willing to, it's very open to. We've been having discussions with government about it. We want to make it a success. We want to make it work because at the end of the day, it's in our interests to be doing things as safely as possible.
Do you think it's going to become the norm, if you want to go out to these kinds of things, that you have to have a test on your way in? Is that just something we're going to get used to?
I think it depends on the pandemic circumstance. So I hope we can all get to a point where we don't have to wear masks on public transport. We don't have to be doing a test before events. We don't have to be doing all sorts of things that have impacted our lives over the past 18 months. But if you're in the middle of a pandemic and the choice is either lock everything down and don't allow stuff to happen, or look for the sensible, smart mitigations that can enable normal life to go on, while also ensuring you're doing things safely, then I think that's sensible. So I expect events for the foreseeable future will be with some form of certification. And I expect we'll then get to a point where that is relaxed and that is taken away. And then if you have another spike up, a new variant, it may then be reintroduced. But I think we're living in an age of pandemics at the moment. And so the smart thing is to say, don't just put your head in the sand and wish it all to go away. You look at what you need to be doing as an industry, look at what you need to be doing as a government to ensure that these sorts of things can be happening safely.
Now, you're a former Conservative special advisor. You'll know better than most just how much unrest there will be on the Conservative backbenches were these sort of COVID passports, if I can call them that, are to be brought in. What is your message to MPs and other campaigners who think that this sort of thing is just a huge infringement of our civil liberties?
I think there's been no greater infringement of civil liberties than what we've seen in the past 18 months, which is the whole sector's been shut down, not allowed to operate. I'd probably actually make an anti-lockdown case for certification. I generally think if you'd have had a system of certification, if you'd have had the testing capacity to be able to make it work in March.
Oh, have we lost Jamie there?
I think we've lost Jamie. We'll endeavour to get him back. Interesting though, Jamie seems quite convinced that certification or passports are going to go ahead. Noises from the government a little bit different to that. Anyway, I think we've got Jamie back now.
Are you back with us, Jamie?
I'm back with you. Sorry about that.
That's all right. It's good to have you back. What I wanted to ask you was how difficult the waiting is for your industry. Given the government's roadmap and given we're not going to get an announcement on this until June the 14th, venues are only going to have a week to know whether they're going to be allowed to reopen or not. Is that a big problem for them?
It's a huge problem for them, particularly when lots of them have got staff on furlough. They don't really know whether they should be taking people off furlough, putting them back on, because they're not able to put them back on.
We've lost Jamie again. Interesting. As I was just saying there, Jack, he seems reasonably sure that certification vaccine passports domestically are going to go ahead. Now, all the noise coming out of government is that they're now redundant. Matt Hancock was sitting on a fence on that this morning, saying the reviews are still ongoing. But it does rather sound like the music industry, the live music industry, which Jamie obviously represents, is wholly dependent on these vaccine passports happening, because otherwise they're going to stay closed.
Well, you can see why they would be coming from that point of view, because effectively these things are by their nature super spreader events, aren't they? It's very difficult for these venues, almost more than anything else in society, to be going ahead. And so I suppose they think that anything and is worth it. Okay, let's have one more go with Jamie. Jamie, you were just telling us how difficult the waiting has been for venues to see whether they can reopen in 2 weeks' time or not. Is that a failure by the government not to be able to give businesses a bit more certainty than they've had so far?
It's hard. I can see it from both sides. I've worked in government, and when you're dealing with a virus that can move incredibly quickly, you often can't take decisions months and months out with total confidence and total certainty. So I completely understand why the government is having to wait until potentially the last possible moment to decide whether or not they can open up or not. But then also for our industry, it's awful, because you've got people being asked to make business decisions when they don't have any certainty. We haven't been able to get insurance for our industry, which is causing all sorts of problems for events which have to put up sometimes millions of pounds without knowing if they're going to lose that or not. And there are many organisations, many venues right now which are being put in an incredibly difficult position, because they're having to work out right now, do we take people off furlough? Do we start booking people? Do we start to be putting a lot of money behind events which in a week's time may be cancelled? And you can see bankruptcies, you can see music venues being put out of business. So it's incredibly difficult for our industry when we don't have any sort of certainty in this awful pandemic.
As you say, up until recently, you were working within the Department of Health in this government that was and helping to make these decisions as a special advisor to Matt Hancock. I was just wondering how difficult it was for you a couple of weeks ago to watch your two old bosses going at it hammer and tongs. You report to Matt Hancock, and you also used to report to Dominic Cummings, and suddenly you had to watch Mr. Cummings on TV slagging off Matt Hancock, calling me a liar. What did you make of all that, Jamie?
Look, I worked with Matt for a long time in government. Over the course of the pandemic, every day he'd essentially wake up saying, what do I need to do to protect life? What do I need to do to ensure this country is as best protected as possible in what are incredibly difficult circumstances? And I think the way he conducted himself over the course of the pandemic was exemplary. There were all sorts of challenges we faced, whether it was global shortages of PPE, whether it was testing capacity that started March at 2000 and we wanted to get up as high as possible, or a vaccine that we were all being told was never going to come for months and years and years and years. And Matt was the sort of person that didn't just say, okay, I'm going to accept that. He said, what do I need to be doing to ensure we're protecting life, beating this pandemic? And if you just take testing, in March 2020, we had the capacity to test a few thousand people a day. We wanted to be testing as many people in hospitals. We wanted to be testing as many people in care homes, but we weren't able to do it. And as a result of the sort of work Matt did by ramping up testing in March, we got to a position where we could test everyone going into care homes, everyone going into hospital, staff going into care homes, and that will have actually saved lives. And I worked very closely with him for the better part of 2.5 years, and I felt very privileged to be doing so.
Given all that, why would Dominic Cummings say all those things about him and say that he lied and he should have been sacked?
Ask me. I don't know. Pretty much everything that he said in that select committee, I didn't see all of it. I got to the point where he said it'd be better if we had a dictatorship and stopped watching at that point. But But no, pretty much all of the things he was sort of saying don't really match up with my recollection of how things worked out. And I think when Matt is at the select committee this week, that's going to become very clear.
But I think that the broader picture that Dominic Cummings pasted of a pretty chaotic time in government, with decisions being made very much on the hoof, and not always the right decisions being taken, you would surely accept that at least was a true picture. I mean, it didn't feel like a strong and stable government at certain times, as someone once called it.
No, look, when you're dealing with a pandemic, I remember those early meetings when you've got patchy data coming from China. You're not sure if this virus is sort of going to kill 0.01% of people who catch it. At one point, they were even worried the fatality rate could be as high as 4%. You're having to make really difficult, complex decisions in a landscape where you've got very little information. The data that's coming out of China is incredibly patchy, and you're having to learn as you're working on this what you should essentially be doing. There's lots of things like asymptomatic transmission, aerosol generation spread. I think we now accept and recognise that this is a virus which is spread probably much more through aerosol generated procedures than just droplets. And yet now in those early months, everyone, the WHO, other countries were saying it's just about hands, face, space. It's not necessarily about airborne transmission. There's so much we've been having to learn about this virus, because at the end of the day, it's a novel virus. It's something we've never seen before. Every country was having to deal with it. And I think a lot of the decisions that were made were the best decisions made on the information we had at the time. And I think as we kind of look back on the pandemic, and hopefully we can look back on it with obviously a critical eye, because these things are going to be coming around again and again and again. And we need to know how best we should be dealing with them in the future. But I think the people who are working on the pandemic, I think Matt and I think Dom Cummings, and I think everyone who was working in government doing the very best they could, focus on how to protect lives and how to protect the NHS, how to protect care homes, how to protect people across the country. And I think as we look back on this pandemic, people do recognise that ministers were doing the very best they can, and in awful circumstances were taking the best decisions they had with the information they had at the time.
And just finally, I know Tom wants to come in quickly with one question, but when you look back on your time in the Department of Health now, do you have one regret that do you think, God, if we'd just done that thing differently, it could have been so much better?
I think it's so difficult to try and make policy with hindsight. The approach I've always took when I was working in government was try and work out where you're going to be in 6 months' time, and make sure you don't have any regrets in 6 months' time. Make sure you're not wishing you were doing things now in 6 months' time. And in a pandemic, that's incredibly difficult. If we go back 6 months ago, people were sort of looking around things in November thinking, oh, are we going to be okay? We don't need to worry too much. In 6 months' time, we may be looking back now and thinking there should be things we should have been doing in June 2021 that we weren't doing then. It's incredibly difficult to make policy with hindsight. And there are many people around who seem to claim that you can make policy with hindsight. But when you're in government, the problem of governing is making the best decisions you can with the information you have at the time.
Jamie, hi, it's Tom. Thanks for coming on. Just on Cummings, here's a weird thing. Dominic Cummings reckons your boss should have been fired 15 to 20 times. It sounded like there was, from his evidence, an almighty ding-dong going backwards and forwards throughout this early period of pandemic between Number 10 and the Department of Health where you were working. Yet you seem blissfully ignorant of any of Dominic Cummings' criticisms at all. Was there really no criticism from Cummings to your boss at the time? Is this really all out the blue, or was actually a fair bit of tension then too?
It is. There were countless people in Number 10 who you were working incredibly closely with every day, and having incredibly good relationships with in what were incredibly strained times. I mean, it's a pandemic. You're not going to expect it to be a low pressure environment. But I think a lot of the criticisms we had, I'd say the testing one was the main one that sort of gobsmacked me a little bit, because by the sounds of it, what Mr. Cummings was saying was that Matt was interfering with testing and was sort of slowing down our testing ramp up. Well, Tom, I remember getting daily calls from people and journalists at the time saying Matt's being way too ambitious on testing. This is mad. 100,000 tests a day. This is absolutely nonsense. When Matt set that testing target, no one believed he was going to meet it. No one in Westminster believed he was going to meet it. He was actually a little bit of a laughing stock for being too ambitious on testing. And I'm pretty sure the analysis at the time wasn't that he was being too slow and wasn't being practical enough. So there's lots of these criticisms that are being made now that absolutely were not being made at the time.